next is a panel titled The Wellness Think Tank Improving Physician Wellness and Resiliency in Emergency Medicine. Please welcome moderator Nikita Joshi and panelists Arlene Chung, Nicole Battaglioli, and Shahina Braganza.
Good morning, everybody. How are you all doing? Good, I'm glad. We're here today to talk about the Wellness Think Tank based upon academic life in emergency medicine. This is an organization that we created, and we want to talk to you about how and why we got to where we are today, about a year after the idea was originally conceived. The issue of burnout, wellness, resiliency is an important issue in medical training. And it's an issue that many who are outside of medicine don't necessarily know a lot about. So that's what we want to talk to you about today. What are the issues? Why are these words burnout, wellness, resiliency associated with medical training today? What were the issues and what were the solutions that we came up with? We also want to make this interactive, and throughout this we will have times for questions, and we definitely want you to feel free to ask us any questions you may have as well. We hope to make this a back and forth dialogue as much as possible. Ultimately, we want to shed light into the problem, give a glimpse into those who don't know about medical training, what it's like to be a graduate medical learner, and come up with better solutions perhaps than what we have even come up with. First, I want to introduce the panel that I have with me, starting with Arlene.
Hi, everyone. My name is Arlene Chung. I am a practicing emergency physician in New York City, and I am also one of the assistant residency program directors for the Mount Sinai Emergency Medicine Residency Program.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shahina Braganza. I am an emergency physician from Gold Coast Health in Australia, and I've also recently finished up a role which is the Director of Clinical Training, looking after our pre-vocational doctors.
My name is Nicole Battaglioli. I'm a practicing emergency medicine physician at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota.
And again, I am Nikita Joshi. I work here at Stanford University. I'm one of the emergency medicine doctors involved with resident education, but also medical student education. Throughout this talk, we want to share our own stories of burnout so that it can perhaps give insight as to why we are actually personally vested in this issue as well. And my story, I also was trained in New York City at a county hospital in Brooklyn, and my training was 4 years. It was a pretty grueling experience from day one. It started off kind of already on the go. And of course, my fellow residents understood what I was going through, but that really is a very small subset of people compared to everyone else that I knew. And that included my husband, my parents. They didn't quite understand what I was going through. And I realized that I had a problem when I would come home and try to explain the situation, whatever I had experienced that day with my husband, who's not in the medical field. I tried to explain to him the emotional roller coaster I went through that day based upon the patients I had seen, the workload, what it was like to work with consultants, perhaps difficult encounters, and more than anything, I just actually wanted him to just listen and not say anything back. I never got that. I always got words of advice, none of which I wanted, and it became actually so frustrating to the point where I stopped talking to him. And we hit a point in our relationship where it actually challenged our relationship. And there was a good point where I saw that perhaps this may not be able to move forward because my experience was so difficult. I felt so unable to talk to him about it. And of course, we moved on, persevered. I graduated. We're married. We have a child. And things are better now. But it's this issue of loneliness, having no one to really talk to, that's just a small subset of the whole issue of what leads to burnout and what we hope to explore here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Arlene right now.
What if I told you that there was a disease out there that only affected smart, capable, compassionate, and motivated people? What if I told you that this disease was almost always fatal, killing almost 100% of the people who it touched, and that the symptoms were completely unrecognizable to most people. If I told you that, and the CDC knew about that, they would be on top of that in a heartbeat. But there is a disease like that, or maybe not a disease in the true sense, but certainly an illness out there, and it's physician suicide. And one of the things that we hope to do today is to shed light on this issue. I moved to New York City in 2014, shortly after residency, and I had a passing interest in wellness while I was in residency, and I was part of the wellness committee there. And to be honest, it was mostly just organizing social events and resident gatherings, which was fine, which was great. And personally, yes, I thought residency was hard, but I got through it and I survived, and I said, okay, I am leaving and I am going to New York City to live my attending life. And within the first couple months of arriving there, this article came out in the New York Times, which was the first sort of realization for me that this type of problem existed. Shortly after I arrived in New York City, several other people also arrived in New York City because it was July, right? As anyone knows, July is day one of medical training for so many of our medical school graduates. And two of them at the same institution in New York City both committed suicide within a week of each other. They both jumped from the top of the hospital to their deaths below. And this article came out in the New York Times shortly afterwards. And one of the things that it did for me in reading it is that I came to realize that there is a problem in medicine, and it's a problem that we're really, I think, ashamed of, and we don't really want other people to know about. But there are these things that keep happening, and they're going to keep happening unless we address the problem. As the author writes, there is a strange machismo that pervades medicine. Doctors, especially fledgling doctors like me, feel pressure to project intellectual, emotional, and physical prowess beyond what we truly possess. As soon as that MD is appended to our name in May, our self-expectations skyrocket as if the conferral of the degree were an enchantment of infallibility. The internal pressure to excel is tremendous. After all, we are real doctors now. But there is a spectrum. It doesn't just start with a happy college graduate and then all of a sudden become a physician who's on the brink of committing suicide. There is stress, certainly, which leads to burnout, which leads to depression, which then leads to suicide. This graph is just demonstrating data, but I mean there have been several studies that have been published since looking exactly what are the prevalence rates of depression and suicidality in our medical trainees, and it's enormous. If you're not aware that this is a problem, if you look, it gets up as high as over 30%. And can you imagine if that 30% went on and no one recognized that there was an issue, and they went on to become physicians, and 1 in 3 physicians was suffering inside without being able to tell anyone, and with having this sort of shame that they were struggling with this alone. And in fact, it's true. If you look at studies that are beyond even medical trainees, this is a study that was done in a population of U.S. physicians across the spectrum of career, so from early career to late career, across all different specialties. And if you look, on average, the average burnout rate for all physicians is almost 50%. Emergency medicine has the dubious honor of being number 1 at the top of this graph. If you see that little gray line that is shooting way above everyone else, that's emergency medicine, which is the specialty that I practice in. So clearly this is an issue that's important to me as well. And so I got really involved in wellness, right? I personally, I had my struggles in residency. I wouldn't say that I ever suffered from burnout, but I really felt compassion almost more for my fellow physicians than I did for the patients, which, it's our job as doctors to take care of the patients, and we will take care of patients. But the question that I had is, we're so dedicated to patient care, but who's dedicated to our care? Well, we have to be dedicated to our own care. And so I became involved in wellness organizations and in promoting physician wellness. And the culture that I was exposed to the first few years in New York following that first summer of 2014 was really encouraging. I was like, we're making strides, we're making progress, we're doing it. And then this happened. And then August 17th happened. On the morning of August 17th, at about 5:15 in the morning, there was a medical student who was at my institution who walked to the top of the hospital, which was joined with the medical school. And she was a girl in her 4th year who had struggled with depression for her entire medical school career. The deans knew about it, her close advisors knew about it. Everyone was watching her. She was in treatment, she was in therapy, she was on medication. She seemed to be doing well. She walked to the top of the building and she jumped. And she landed on the sidewalk and she was probably dead when she hit the ground. Bystanders scooped her up. They rushed her to the emergency department where my residents and my medical students, who were her friends, attempted to resuscitate her and bring her back to life. But by then she had already gone. And this was less than 1 year ago, after we had thought that we had made these strides in New York City. And this is still happening because as I think that one of our deans, David Muller, had written this perspectives piece in the New England Journal, and I think he described it well, why this keeps happening, why doctors are committing suicide. It's because there's a culture of performance and achievement that for most of our students begins in middle school and relentlessly intensifies for the remainder of their adult lives. From their very first shadowing experience to their foray into the lab, from high school AP classes to GPAs and the MCAT, with helicopter parents, violins, varsity soccer, medical school rankings, licensing exams, and the residency match, we never let up on them, and it's killing them. So why do doctors commit suicide? We commit suicide because there is intense pressure to succeed. There's intense pressure to excel from a very young age. There is a very tiny margin for failure, and there's so much shame and stigma surrounding it. But what we hope to do is to pull back the curtains and to show you exactly what goes on inside, and hopefully to shed light on this and to create a solution together.
And that's why we think that this presentation is also so pertinent to have at this conference, where it's not just about medicine, but about the entire community coming together and looking at how we are training, pulling back the curtain, as Arlene says. So I want to take a moment if anybody has any other thoughts besides what Arlene has mentioned about the topic of why doctors commit suicide, and any insight you may have as to why that happens.
Hi, so I'm actually a first-year medical student at Mount Sinai, so nice to meet you, and I'm sure we'll talk after this. So just regarding this topic, I actually studied positive psychology at Penn. Last year I got my master's in it before coming to med school, and so I did a lot of research into this topic. I've heard everything from, I don't want to reach out for mental health resources because then, I'll have to check that box on my licensing exams as I continue to get licensed. Like you said, the stigma, fear of, thinking that you're compromised and unable to treat patients. And I think it's also a lack of emphasis on this in our medical education, as I'm sure you're addressing. We are so focused on taking care of patients. As you said, no one's helping us take care of ourselves, and our institutions need to support it. It can't just be up to the individual. So we're making, a lot of changes, and I look forward to the rest of the talk, but this is so important. So thank you.
I think it's also important, again, to have it at conferences like this so that we can get input not just from the doctors dealing with this supposed doctor problem, but also from the patients and the industry themselves, because everybody really is impacted from having a physician who may not be mentally stable and who may be suffering from suicide.